there's a quilt in that son's
Yeah,
race.
she just saw him.
And his sister just graduated last year.
Hey, Charles.
And so then John Morse is the state director for nature reserves. And it's just,
It's 9:50.
you're so shocked because they let
On the dot.
Why don't we, yes, on the dot, thanks to my cell phone telling me. Let's bow our heads for prayer. Gracious and loving God, we give you thanks for this time together. Share our understanding of Scripture and to grow in that understanding and to apply it to life, to think about life in biblical times and life today and to see how it's different and how it's the same. Grant that we might be open to your Spirit and gain in wisdom and knowledge. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so this is just to kind of get us back on board. This is part 2 of a series. I taught part 1 or led part 1 back in the spring, late spring. And the course is income inequality in the Bible. And so I want to do some review this morning to kind of just to refresh our memory about what we learned from the previous section. And I'll do my same 2 disclaimers that I did when I started part 1. It's not a stewardship sermon in disguise. I'm not out to get you to increase your pledge. I know this is the time of year churches have to start thinking about that, but this is not what this is about. And I really want to make sure you all understand I'm not out to make anyone feel ashamed or guilty of having a certain amount of wealth or income. You know, Presbyterians tend to be upper middle class-ish. I mean, we're in there somewhere. And I have no problem with folks being successful financially and having wealth and being able to save that and transfer some of it to the children and to donate, to just live a full, rich life, rich more than just in terms of money. But the only thing I would say is, you know, I'm not out to make anybody feel ashamed of their wealth or their income or their property. The only exception might be if we have a secret billionaire in here somewhere, then you and I probably need to talk. Just sit down with Helen. I'm sure we can come up with some ideas. Other than that, that's not the first. So I want to go over the outline for the second part of the class. I didn't put that in your study sheet, so this morning I want to do a quick review of what we did last spring. Look at 2 or 3 of the key passages from the Torah that have to do with economics, just to refresh our minds. And today I want to spend the session on, the other half of number 1 is, once we do the review, I want to spend time on Jesus' attitude toward the law. I want to spend some time kind of giving you the background, the economic realities of the days when Jesus was alive on earth. And I want to explore how he related to the law, because that's the connection between part 1 and part 2. So I want to make sure we get that in mind. Once we've done that, next week we're going to look at what Jesus had to say about money. Then we're going to look at some of his parables that deal with wealth or poverty or all those kinds of things. And the 4th session will be Paul's letters, things that he had to say about generosity or poverty, money. We'll probably work in what's the passage? Is it from Timothy that people always misunderstand? They say that money is the root of all evil. Helen, do you remember what letter is that in? Is that Timothy or she'll look it up? But it's widely misunderstood because what the text actually says, maybe it's changed. It's the love of money, meaning the addiction of money. So we'll kind of work that in. So that's where we're going, just so you have some idea of what we're doing. So let's take a look at your study guide. And
1 Timothy 6:10.
okay.
The love of money is a root of all kinds of evil.
And we usually somehow lose the word love, which I think means addiction, that kind of unhealthy love. Would anyone be willing to read the passage from Deuteronomy? This is our review of what we did last spring.
The first part?
Yeah, just
Okay.
Deuteronomy.
Deuteronomy 17.
Oh, yeah, they're all, yeah, the first one, sorry.
16 through 17 of the king.
Clear.
Even so, he must not acquire many horses for himself, or return the people to Egypt in order to acquire more horses, since the Lord has said to you, you must never return that way again. And he must not acquire many wives for himself, or else his heart will turn away. Also, silver and gold he must not acquire in great quantity for himself.
And who is?
I'm so glad they mentioned horses and women. The same. Sequential sentence.
Horses first.
Yes, the horses were
Horse?
first.
Then women, then silver and gold.
Right, there you go.
All right, so we might think about that order. Who is being addressed in this? Well, the people are being addressed, but who is it about? Who must not do these things?
The Hebrew people,
No,
the slaves.
no.
Well, you've got the king.
Yes, it's the king.
Oh.
It's political leadership. That political leaders are not supposed to be wealthy. They're not supposed to have many wives. You have to kind of, I mean, how did you measure wealth in those days? Eastern kings were proud of their harems. That was a way of status and power. Horses, that was part of the economy, wasn't it? That was a symbol of power and might. The army used horses. Silver and gold. What comes along with great quantities of silver and gold? Wealth. Did you say?
Like wealth.
Yeah. And wealth then translates into
Property, greed sometimes.
property, greed,
Power.
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 That's what I was fishing for, but
Bingo.
all those are correct. The more money you have, the more wealth you have, the more power you have. And you exercise that power, not necessarily in the interests of the common people. That makes sense? Where did the Israelites get this insight? Why do they have this concern about their leaders becoming too wealthy and powerful? What had their ancestors experienced that gave them a different outlook on
Well,
life?
slavery in Egypt.
Yes, they remembered that their ancestors had been slaves in Egypt. So when we think about our ancestry and the things that we're proud of, or the things, the hardships that our ancestors had to overcome, it's not that different from the Hebrews thinking back on our ancestors were slaves in Egypt. That gives them a different view of the world. Does that make sense? And so they have this interest in, they don't want to go back to that. I mean, in this text, God is saying, no, you don't go back to that. No more slavery. Now, you can talk about how well they did with following that. But, and then let's look at the next one, the next Deuteronomy. The 7-year remission. Anyone feels?
Every 7th year you shall grant a remission of debts. And this is the manner of remission. Every creditor shall remit the claim that is held against a neighbor, not exacting it, because the Lord's remission has been proclaimed. Of a foreigner you may exact it, but you must remit your claim on whatever any member of your community owes you. There will, however, be no one in need among you, because the Lord is sure to bless you in the land that the Lord your God is giving you as a possession to occupy. If only you will obey the Lord your God by diligently observing this entire commandment that I command you today.
thoughts, comments, reactions?
Well, it's interesting, it's, foreigners gotta be treated differently.
Yes. Yeah. The word in the text is probably stranger, that gets translated as stranger, foreigner, immigrant, or refugee. All of those are valid interpretations of that Hebrew word. And there are regulations about how you treat strangers.
But yet the fourth verse says, there will, however, be no one in need among you, which I presume would be foreigners as well as.
Yeah, there will be no one.
I had never heard before that not only did you forgive the debts of those who owed you money, you actually paid that amount to them. So that's what I read here, is that right?
I don't think so.
You shall remit the claim that is held against a neighbor, not extracting it.
Right.
Now, to remit to me means to pay. And so, if my neighbor owes me $100, I've got to pay somebody, remit $100. If I'm reading this right, I'm not.
The way I'm hearing it is that you don't collect it, you forgive it.
That's
So
what I
you're out the
understand.
money that you were owed.
Yeah. So, but now, this is where how I connected to that,
Yeah.
remit the amount, so.
Dave?
But the dictionary definition of remit, I think, is not to collect, not to extract. So it's not taking something, as opposed to a common understanding of remit means to pay something.
Well, actually, it's both. So,
It
one,
may
the
be-
first definition is to cancel or refrain from extracting.
Right, okay.
The second is to send in payment or as a gift.
Yeah, and that's
So
the
it's
lower,
both.
in the order.
But yeah, but it's both, which is
Yeah.
kind of interesting.
Okay.
So,
It'd be
I
interesting.
hadn't thought of it that way, but that's an interesting.
It'd be interesting to know what the Hebrew word
Yeah.
is and what its definition is.
But, yeah, just that idea, now, if I, in fact, view it with that second definition, that's sort of interesting, because it would say, yeah, you probably don't want to have a bunch of people owing you stuff after 7 years, because, wait a minute, I find that an interesting economic, you know.
And so the determination would be on the 6th year to just go out and collect that any way you can.
And there is a text.
There's always a loophole.
In Deuteronomy, there is a text that says, don't be hard-hearted and do exactly what you're saying.
But part of that might go with the thing that there will be no one in need. So if somebody is suffering from an immense amount of debt and hasn't been able to have whatever they need because they're paying their creditors all the time, you know, that might be in some way in terms of saying, and if you need to help them out because they're not able to get what they need. I mean, that's an interesting.
Then do you decide how they got themselves into debt and then make a judgment about whether that's something that they need to bear the burden of or something I should be a part of?
Yeah.
I mean, the complications are just so incredible when we think about society.
And there's no evidence that these laws were ever obeyed. So,
Yeah.
but, you know, what I'm after is the purpose behind them, and I think the key is that line, there will, however, be no one in need among you. So it's this dream that came out of Exodus with the refugees who left Exodus and settled in Canaan. They had this dream, what could we do differently to build an economy or a society where we don't have to have poor people, where there just isn't. I think that's the dream. Now, how you make that a reality is, that's where the complications come in. And then, if that's not enough, let's look at Leviticus.
And you shall hallow the 50th year, and you shall proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you. You shall return every one of you to your property, and every one of you to your family. That 50th year shall be a jubilee for you. You shall not sow or reap the aftergrowth or harvest the unclean vines. For it is a jubilee. It shall be holy to you. You shall eat only what the field itself produces.
I don't understand the agricultural pieces of that, but every 50 years, it's as if, well, what do you think that is? How would you describe that law?
Unobserved.
Yes. It was.
Yes, yeah.
A friend of mine who was a farmer in Oklahoma explained to me that the Dust Bowl days really were because of the farming. I mean, it was a drought, but it also was the farming, and that they had learned a lot, you know, recently, not everything, but in terms of, you know, and he loved to do, you know, rotating crops and doing this and that, but also there's a time you gotta let it life out so it can recover. But I thought, because his comment was interesting, is he said, you know, if we hadn't changed that, and he'd said this to me, I was there in the early 2000s, he said, you know, our drought today is worse than the Dust Bowl days, but because we changed our farming, we're able to keep it going. You know, but I mean, it was just an interesting thing in terms of, okay, what does the land need to be, you know, reproductive, or the land Sabbath, you know, which we talked about people, but I just think that's interesting that the land needs to have one too, in some ways. Anyway, I just find that interesting that if we think of the Dust Bowl as being somewhat also caused by farming practices, it makes this an interesting statement.
There's a wonderful book by Timothy Egan about that. And part of it started with some of the immigrants who came from Russia or the area in that vicinity, and they brought with them winter wheat, which before that there wasn't, we didn't have that in the US. So the winter wheat was, it did very well. And so farmers did very well. So they reclaimed a little bit more of the prairie then, planted into winter wheat. Plus we were getting better farming equipment. So the farmers could farm more land. So as they broke up the prairie, then you had all this dirt that was there for blowing around when the winds came, and that helped lead to this.
Was that the worst part?
Yes.
Yeah. And I hadn't realized, because this friend of mine, he would test the soil before he decided what he was gonna plant. Because different crops use different parts of the soil. So he would test it to see, you know, what would be the best, most beneficial thing to plant there, which I hadn't ever really thought about. I figured you just planted whatever you planted, but his thing was he would always test the soil before figuring out what he was gonna plant where, because he wanted to see where it would grow, what would grow the best in the soil that he was working with.
My dad back in the 50s rotated, well, the 40s too, but I wasn't around.
Yeah.
I was really little in the 50s, but anyway, he rotated crops and had at least one field that lied, that was fallow every year. And
Paul, are there any images in the Old Testament of how the Hebrew people lived out the command regarding Jubilee? I can't think of any. I can think of New Testament images of Jesus trying to, taking away from the farming image, the restoration of humanity with one another, with God, and with creation, and being that the acceptable year of the Lord, as he identified in his statement to the people. He was reading scripture and talking about the poor and about the relationship with each other. And that being kind of an image of Jubilee. But I can't think of any images in the Old Testament that live into that command. So the word unobserved seems to be appropriate, but that's just maybe because of my thin reading of scripture. I haven't found it.
Yeah, it'd be interesting if you did a word study the Hebrew word jubilee and just see where it turns up, or if it does, anywhere other than these laws. You know, you would think it would occur somewhere in the prophets, but I can't think of anything yet. Excuse me.
The only thing that brought that to mind was the gleaning in Ruth.
Yes.
And that sort of thing, so there was, okay, don't take the edges, that's for other people.
Yeah.
Right.
Need it.
And there were
But it isn't- it
Sabbath
isn't a
laws that
year
included animals. You let your animals also rest and recover.
Could you also ask the question of what does technology do to defining where these changes are taking place? Farming technology has changed over several hundred years and so on. Other types of technology and important factors and what works and what doesn't.
Right.
Well, we're
And what are
trying
the
to put back into the
consequences?
soil the nutrients that would have been restored over time. And of course, that continues to make the land productive, but yet it really depletes it. And then it runs into our rivers. Now we've got a whole new problem on rivers.
We're using chemicals to do it now.
Now you're getting somewhere.
Well, this is what the whole Land Institute research has been about, is developing a crop that is a perennial. It doesn't have to be replanted, it doesn't have to be fertilized.
And
And it
seed
makes a
makers
world
don't
of
want
difference.
that.
Yeah. And
The
it's
folks who sell seed.
been used in, some poorer nations, but we haven't adopted it yet in the United States.
My first call was in a rural parish in southern Ohio. A lot of farmers. The old guys who were still doing the old model of farming, crop rotation, animal husbandry, they didn't specialize in one crop or one kind of animal. They weren't, rich. They weren't poor. They were doing all right. But the younger generation was getting killed financially because interest rates were up around 13%. And if they had concentrated on raising hogs, it cost more to feed them than they would ever get from selling them, depending on what the market did. So the old guys, their wisdom was actually working better. It might not have been as efficient in some ways. So yeah. This passage from Leviticus, I think was intended as an economic reset. In other words, like a reset button where you start over. Because I've gotten kind of cynical about economics. I kind of get the idea, this is just me, that any economy, whether it's capitalist, communist, socialist, maybe even gift economies, I don't know about that, but they all tend to concentrate, left alone, they all tend to concentrate money and wealth in the hands of a very few people. It seems inevitable that happens, human beings being human. And so, every once in a while, maybe, I think the intention behind this was, let's reset this. Let's get families back on their ancestral lands. Let's get people who've been sold into slavery to pay debts out of slavery. Let's return things to a starting point, and back to that goal where there won't be any poor people in the economy. Of course, no evidence they ever followed that Jubilee law, but I think that was what the intention was. Let's move on. I want to take a few minutes and set the stage for the passages we're going to be looking at in the New Testament, particularly the economic conditions that the Jewish people were facing, or Judean people were facing during the lifetime of Jesus of Nazareth. They were occupied by the Romans. And, I think we tend to oversimplify history. I remember from Western Civ classes how great the Roman Empire was, the Pax Romana, the system of roads, the aqueducts and all of that, and that's all perfectly true. The might of the Roman army did away with all of the little local infighting among city-states and small countries. The roads allowed for trade. So there were some people within any occupied territory who could become merchants and make some money by trading. The army kept the roads safe. So you get all of those kinds of things. But there's another side to the Roman Empire. It was really founded on slavery. I mean, that's what made it work. And it was brutal. If you got out of line, they didn't tolerate it. And you could even say that in some ways it was a form of terrorism. And it's odd that we Christians don't often see that, but crucifixion was a horrible way of putting people to death. And the Romans did that in public. They'd line up crosses along the road so everyone had to see. This is what happens to you if you don't, if you try to stand up to the empire. That's a part of, the Roman Empire that we don't often think about. The other thing is the economic conditions. Taxes were heavy. I mean, you had to support the army. You had to maintain the roads. You had to pay off politicians. It was just this enormous, you had to feed the army, the occupying army. So what was happening in Galilee was that in the best of years, local families on their ancestral farms could barely make it. I mean, it was tight. And in the worst of years, they didn't make it. And so then they were left with choices. Do I sell my property to a Gentile? Because Jews don't have any money to buy property, right? So it's going to be a Gentile. Or do I sell one of my children into slavery? I mean, think about that. Do I sell myself into slavery to pay off my debts? How do I do that? So what was happening around Galilee, and that was the kind of the breadbasket of Judea. That was where, if you've ever been there, that's the most fertile area of Israel. It's still semi-arid, but there's a lot of crops that grow there. A lot of farming. Of course, they can irrigate, so they've done well. But local families, Jewish families, were losing their ancestral property to Gentiles, and they wound up sharecropping their own ancestral lands. And then the bulk of the profits, which was crops, that's how you paid your taxes. They went off to warehouses on the Mediterranean to use to feed Roman garrisons. I mean, that was the reality of what was happening. Jesus grew up in the middle of that. The fact that his father, adopted father, was a craftsman. We say carpenter, but it was probably more likely a stonemason. Probably carpenter too, but in that area, probably worked in the city of Sepphoris, where there was a lot of building going on. They probably weren't able to make a living by farming any longer. So now think of are you familiar with the parable of the Syro-Phoenician woman? We always have to give stories of fancy name. Are you familiar with that story? Jesus is tired from his ministry. He goes out of Israel to a foreign country, and he's just looking for a vacation. And there's a woman who wants him to heal her child. Is it a daughter? I can't remember. Daughter. She's got a demon or she's sick. And the disciples say, leave him alone. He's trying to have a vacation. Get out of here. But she's just persistent. And she finally gets in the house, and you have this encounter between her and Jesus. One of my favorite stories. Probably because it's disturbing in some ways. And she says, would you please heal my daughter? She's sick. And he says, I was sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. I don't have a mission to Gentiles. Leave me alone. And she persists. She asks again. And he says, it's not fair to give the children's bread to the dogs. And that's the harsh saying. And, people have said, well, he really used the Aramaic word for puppies, so it's not really his song. Well, that's nonsense. But I've always wondered, and this might be my way of softening it, but I've always wondered, was he quoting a Galilean proverb? It's not fair to give the children's bread to the dogs. Because that's what was happening. Children in Galilee were going hungry, living on farms, and the crops were going to pay taxes. So I don't know if he's just reflecting the situation that he grew up in. And, you know, you can look at it that way, or you can just, I actually prefer to see it the other way around. Jesus was a master at debate. He could, nowhere in the New Testament do you see him losing a debate except this one time. She says, well, that's right, you can't give the children's bread to the dogs, but the dogs at least get the crumbs that fall from the table. And she has beat him at his own game. And he goes, whoa, your faith is amazing. Your daughter's healed. So then you're left with, well, did she really argue? Did she change his mind? I mean, I think that's worth wrestling with. Because Jesus does, there are stories of him being open to Gentiles and admiring their faith. Anyway, any thoughts about that? Just the economic background in which Jesus grew up. Is it surprising or? No?
The other thing I find interesting is that the tax collectors were seen as Roman polluters. And part of the problem was that they had so much they had to give to Rome, but whatever they collected after that was theirs to keep. So there was a sense that they often took advantage of the situation by collecting, you know, an unfair amount so that they could profit themselves. And I find it interesting because in Jewish law, tax collectors were so looked down upon they could not be witnesses in court.
Yeah.
Because they were considered so outside of what was appropriate behavior for a righteous Jewish person that they could not be witnesses.
And Matthew was a tax collector.
Yeah. So that's where you're fascinating, and then you kind of go, and Jesus, and that's why they always go, Jesus ate with the tax collectors and sinners, right? It's because it's kind of like, well, yeah, I mean, the worst of the worst are the tax collectors, and there are other sinners there too, but the tax collectors are the worst. So, I mean, that just kind of puts it in a context for how much people hated or thought that was an unfair practice.
Let's think about how Jesus dealt with the law. And I'll start by just sort of a rhetorical question. Have you ever heard or said something like this? The Old Testament is all about law, and the New Testament is all about grace. Play with that for a minute. Let's see where that takes you.
Well, it's not what Jesus taught. Jesus was a Jew, and Jesus taught the law.
Yes.
Paul taught salvation by belief in the death and resurrection of Jesus. Jesus taught, repent of your sins and do good works. So there are two separate ways of looking at that. And Jesus was following the Hebrew tradition of the law.
Well, he said he came to fulfill the law.
Yeah. Not to destroy the law, but to fulfill the law.
Right, yeah.
And I think that also plays into, about the woman who talked about the crumbs of the dog. Jesus knew that his mission was to his people, the Hebrew people, and he couldn't spread himself too thin, is the way I've always looked at that. But he knew that he couldn't do it for everybody, but he was here for the Hebrew people, and she was not a Hebrew.
Yeah. What happens if we get too far into that idea where we kind of make them opposites, grace and law? Where could that lead?
Well, you can have cheap grace that way.
Okay, tell me what's cheap grace.
Well, without works.
Okay.
But I was just reading last week that the Hebrew word for faith meant tied in deeds. If you didn't have deeds to follow faith, then your faith was null and void. And so we tend to see Paul's view, salvation by faith and belief in the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, without counting the importance of doing good deeds, where James kept talking about be doers of the word and not hearers only. So they're connected, but we don't see that from the English translation, but you can see it in the Hebrew.
And that reminds me, we tend to think of Torah as law in terms of legalistic law. And it was. I mean, it was their law. And the experts in the law were the ones who knew how to read and write, the scribes, because they hand copied the Torah. So nobody knew the law better than those guys. But the word in Hebrew also means teaching. Is there a difference between law and teaching?
Teaching and instruction,
Yes.
how to live.
Yes. So that picks up your idea of there should be changing behavior, or there should be some behavior that flows from the faith.
I think too, it's just an example of how the law being everything can be a problem. You know, and how Jesus a lot of times went against the law, or with the spirit of the law. And I always find it fascinating. They said by Jesus' day, there was a list of over 1,000 things you could not do on the Sabbath. So it's kind of like, you know, people got so into that being a law that they had all this list of what you, and so it's like, so rather than just saying rest, you know, it's kind of, no, we have this thing that you can or you can't do. And it kind of lost its essence when you got to that point. You know, it's like, so how do you lose the essence of the law when you're so stressed about not doing these 1,000 things that it's like it's not a restful time because you're too stressed out. I mean, it's like an Orthodox friend of mine when I was young went to her house, and you know they tore the toilet paper before Friday evening because that was work, and it was like. You know, and I understand the intent of wanting to rest, but it was kind of like, really, is that, you know, and all that, they couldn't turn on the light bulb because that was on a timer.
Yeah.
Push
They
a
couldn't-
button on an elevator.
Yeah, you can't push a button on an elevator. So in Israel, you have a Sabbath elevator which stops at every floor. So you get in, you don't push the button, and it stops at every floor. So I mean, to me, it's kind of a thing of when does it get to, you know, I mean, and we as a people seem to do that often.
Yes, yes, we do.
that we kind of make it, and we lose the spirit of it.
It's interesting because if I remember, there are 613 commandments in the Torah. Thou shalt not. And it's all kinds of things, not just Sabbath.
Yeah.
And here we wind up with over 1,000 on just the Sabbath.
Yeah.
So it's not the Torah, it's the interpretation and the exposition and the additional kind of work, trying to work out every corollary, every situation.
And how do we live it out, which is what your question, but it's kind of like, but yeah, you can't do everything. So you have to figure it out. You have to figure out what the spirit of it is.
These were people that were in the temple that didn't have anything better than to do.
I know, yeah.
And began to dream up all these.
That's where a lot of the denominations come from too, the great
Oh, yes.
Oh, yeah.
is in how you interpret the law and Jesus' words regarding grace and mercy. My way of thinking about it is, I don't know.
I think, as I think about how Jesus adopted the law, what he thought about the law, how he fulfilled it, that's the word. He relaxed some of the ritual laws, and not necessarily from the Torah, but from all of this additional lawmaking, so that if you know, the text about his disciples eating wheat on the Sabbath, passing through the fields, didn't bother him. You know, people's objection to him healing on the Sabbath because that was work, and he says, look, you know, if you had a sick beast, you take care of your beast on the Sabbath. Why not take care of your neighbor? But I think he amplified the moral and social obligations of the law. That whole series in the Sermon on the Mount, you have heard that it was said, but I say unto you. So, yes, you know, adultery is a sin, but if you're just thinking about it, that's also sinful. Those kinds of things. Where he deepens or strengthens the intent of those laws. So you couldn't just abide by them like by the rule book and think you're okay. That kind of deeper, if that makes any sense. So let's look at what, I want to finish by having us look at a few things that Jesus did say about the law. And from Matthew, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish but to fulfill them. So, he's not letting any of this go. When he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set free those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." Excuse me. And he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him. Then he began to say to them, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." What do you think of that?
Well, it's impressive that he could read the Hebrew,
Yes.
you know, but he was well schooled in the Torah, so he
Yes.
had so much by memory.
Yes.
And this is a prediction from the Old Testament that he was tying himself to.
He was revealing that about himself.
Yes.
That he is.
He reveals a lot about who he is and what he's up to.
And where he preached too, he went into the synagogues, like Paul did. Paul did preaching in the synagogues, even to the Gentiles.
You know, sometimes the evangelists, like Luke, give us little details, sometimes maybe without even intending to. That little phrase, "as was his custom." You know, he just includes that and tells us something, maybe it was intentional, that Jesus was a regular participant in the worship of his people. He saw himself as a Jew, took that seriously. He wasn't setting it aside.
This also shows that he was educated,
Yes.
because he was reading the portion for the Sabbath that time. So he was reading whatever was up next in the Torah.
Either that, or he turned the scroll to the passage that he chose. Maybe he chose this, or maybe it was.
I thought they had a cycle of reading.
Well, they did,
You
so
know,
it
and
could
so
well be
you
that.
read what was the Torah portion for today,
Yeah.
for the Sabbath.
In that case, I bet he knew what the reading was and said, "That's the one I'm doing." Yeah, he takes a passage from Isaiah, so he knows his Bible. And you know, some of the Jesus scholars, while I appreciate their work, some of them tend to say, well, you know, these were peasants, they couldn't read or write, they were pretty ignorant, you know, this is sort of low-grade stuff. Well, I don't think so, because you get this record that he wasn't really an official rabbi. He'd never been to seminary, and yet he knows his Bible and can read it out loud.
Yeah, what we don't know is, of course, is Jesus' earlier years. And there's was some speculation that he was educated in Sephora, which was a large enough community to have a library and so forth.
That fits. I had not heard that before, but that fits. Why did he choose this passage? Is this kind of like his inaugural address? Isn't this in some way his mission statement?
Well, I think he's also saying, this is who I am.
Yes, okay.
He's kind of introducing himself.
Yeah.
If you have any questions. This is it.
Yeah.
It indicates that he knew that he was designed to be a Messiah figure. I guess, because there was some question about at what point in his life did he identify himself as a Messiah?
Mm-hmm.
And this would indicate that by this time he's aware that he is.
So if he amplifies the moral aspects of the Torah, you know, the social justice kind of commandments, do you think he's including the passages we've looked at from the Hebrew Bible? Those economic rules that his people had never followed. Do you think he includes those? Is that part of his mission to?
He taught that when he was teaching, that he wanted people to be fed.
Yes? Well, he did that himself. I mean, the
Yes,
stories
yeah.
are, he found a way to do it. Good news to the poor. In the Beatitudes, Matthew softens it, poor in spirit. But I think the original was the poor. I think it's economic there. Release to the captives. Who were the captives? Were they dangerous criminals?
Well, they were the people captured when Hunter was conquered, wouldn't they?
Yes.
be?
Yeah, there would be people imprisoned. Probably people in debt, in prison for debt.
Yeah.
Political prisoners. John the Baptist, for example. I don't hear him saying, oh, just turn all the criminals loose. But he's looking at his time in history and saying, I hear him saying, we've got a lot of people in prison that don't belong there. So release to the captives. Sight to the blind. There are many stories about Jesus healing blind people. I wonder is there a deeper meaning behind physical sight? And how would you see that?
It could be both, because it could be the sight to the blind when he healed the blind, and it could also be spiritual insight.
Okay.
As being blind to the Spirit of God, because he talked about the spirit of the law, not just the letter of the law, but
Yes,
the spirit of the law.
exactly.
And people were blind to the spirit of the law, but he was not.
So there's different kinds of blindness.
Yeah, and more than one level, a literal level or a deeper level.
And on the deeper level, what happens when the blindness is taken away?
You get insight.
Insight, that's a great word. Into what?
Who knows?
It depends.
What about worldview? I mean, we use that term. Does a spiritual insight change our worldview?
It should, in my opinion.
Worldview has expanded to such a large amount. We can't even relate what the Bible, period, worldview for the Bible period was this big. Our worldview, that big. It's so much greater.
Yeah, we have a view of the universe that, you know, if I think about it too long, it gives me a headache. It's just too big. I can't wrap my tiny brain around it. I mean, I'm fascinated with it. And I listen to scientists talk about it, and I hear a sense of excitement and awe, AWE, that reminds me a little bit of worship, even when there happen to be atheists.
I think that's a very just way to take it. And there are so many things that have been changing in science and in things that were related to this. That it's a moving change that will be found in other places. It's not going to be located just where the Bible is.
does the way we view the world affect our behavior, our relationships?
Well, if you see yourself as an isolationist, that's one view, but if you see yourself as a part of humanity and the world and other countries and cultures, that's a more all-inclusive view.
Yes.
And then there's a view where some people want to include only those that are worthy according to the definition, and everyone else is they compartmentalize who deserves and who doesn't.
That's not Jesus.
No, it is
No.
not, but I think, I feel like I see that often. It's like,
Well, it's being used politically, not for the first time. It's,
you talk about the crucifixion, what popped into my head immediately was, not the crucifixion necessarily of Christ, but that was a fairly routine manner of execution. And I thought about in slave times, they would hang the, Negroes, the slaves that they felt like were trying to seek their own lives or trying to run away, and they would do that often in public.
yeah.
Can't imagine that, just.
I think there's two styles of religion. It's probably oversimplified, but there's one that expands us, brings us together, teaches us compassion for not just the neighbors who look like us or believe like we do, but that every human being is a neighbor. I think that's what Jesus was about. And then there's the kind that works in the opposite way. Well, I'm not like that. I have to have a scapegoat or an enemy to look down on. And that's not to say that there aren't bad actors in the world, for goodness sakes. But when your worldview is, I'm different, I'm not like that, it just sets you up for an unhealthy kind of spirituality. I saw that with recovering people, working as a chaplain and a counselor. The ones who could see that they had a lot in common with everybody else in the group had an excellent chance of recovery. And the ones who were, oh, I don't need this, I don't need a sponsor, I don't need the steps, I'm different. They had an excellent chance of relapse. I don't know, it's just, I think that's a worldview. How do we see ourselves? I kind of wish Thad were here this morning because he's taught me that our neighbors are not just human. Our neighbors are the plants and animals of this planet. Our neighbors are all living things. I have trouble with mosquitoes and that kind of thing.
And it's fly around.
I know, there's a pesky fly in here. But, and I think Native Americans were a lot better than we have been with feeling that connection. And you can romanticize that, but I think that's true.
I was just gonna say, Gandhi said, the Spirit of God is in everything, and then even including this stone that he picked up, the Spirit of God, so that is all inclusive.
Yeah. So, for the next few weeks, we'll be looking at what Jesus had to say about money, what he said about wealth and poverty in parables. We'll look at, try to drink some water. We'll look at what Paul's letters have to say on the issue. So, if I can get my voice back. I just want to say again what a pleasure it is to work with you all. Because we're definitely not starting from scratch. There's a lot of wisdom and experience, and you all know the scriptures. I always learn something every time we do this. It's just, I much appreciate you, and thanks for your participation.
Thank you.
Thank you.